Carl Jung believed there are 5 signs that you are not losing your mind, but evolving into a new, higher form of consciousness. Most people mistake these experiences for mental illness, but Jung discovered something terrifying. The people showing these signs were not breaking down, they were breaking through. And what awaits on the other side changes everything about how you see reality, other people, and yourself. Today I will show you the 5 unmistakable signs of spiritual awakening that Jung spent decades documenting. Because if you are experiencing even one of these, your life is about to transform in ways that will feel both beautiful and terrifying. Jung worked with patients during his most intense period of psychological crisis between 1913 and 1919. During this time, he documented individuals going through what society called nervous breakdowns. But Jung saw something different. These people were not mentally ill. They were spiritually awakening, and the process looked nothing like the peaceful enlightenment stories you hear about. It looked like psychological warfare. Jung called it the individuation process, the painful transformation from unconscious existence to conscious participation in reality. Most people never make it through. Those who do become what Jung called the conscious minority. People who can see patterns others miss, feel connections others deny, and navigate reality at a level that seems almost supernatural. Here is what made Jung realize these experiences were not pathological. Every patient showing these signs eventually emerged stronger, clearer, and more psychologically integrated than before their crisis began. They had not lost their minds, they had found them. The first sign Jung identified appears when reality starts speaking back to you through meaningful coincidences, not random chance, not confirmation bias, actual synchronicities where the external world mirrors your internal psychological state with precision that defies statistical probability. Jung discovered this through his own experience. During his break from Freud, he was thinking intensely about a patient's dream involving a scarab beetle. At that exact moment, a real scarab beetle flew into his window and landed on his desk. Jung realized something profound. The boundary between inner psychological reality and outer physical reality is more permeable than we have been taught. Synchronicity is the universe's language, the way consciousness communicates across the apparent separation between mind and matter. When you start experiencing synchronicities, it means your unconscious mind is breaking through into conscious awareness. You think of someone, and they call. You need specific information, and a book falls off the shelf to the exact page. You dream of an event, and it manifests days later. Society tells you this is coincidence. Jung discovered it is consciousness becoming participatory rather than passive. This is not magical thinking. This is what happens when the psychological isolation that keeps most people trapped in their own heads begins to dissolve. You stop being a separate observer of reality and become a conscious participant in it. But here is what Jung found terrifying about this first sign. Once synchronicities start appearing, they do not stop. Your life becomes a conversation with forces beyond your conscious understanding, and that conversation demands you pay attention in ways that most people are not psychologically prepared for. The second sign appears in your dreams, but not ordinary dreams. Jung documented patients whose dreams transformed from personal psychological material into what he called archetypal transmissions, dreams containing symbols, images, and narratives they had never encountered in waking life. Ancient symbols from cultures they knew nothing about, mythological patterns they had never studied, warnings about events they could not have predicted through ordinary means. Jung called these big dreams, dreams that come not from your personal unconscious, but from the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate that connects all human consciousness across time and space. When you start having archetypal dreams, it means your individual psyche is plugging into something vastly larger than itself. You are receiving transmissions from the collective unconscious. Information your conscious mind did not create and cannot control. These dreams are not symbolic representations of your childhood traumas or daily anxieties. They are direct communications from deeper layers of consciousness attempting to guide your transformation. Here is where the terror enters. Jung found that people experiencing archetypal dreams often could not distinguish between their own psychological material and what was coming from the collective unconscious. They would wake up with information, memories, and experiences that did not belong to them. Ancient knowledge, future events, other people's pain. This is what Jung meant by differentiation, the critical ability to separate what belongs to you from what you are unconsciously absorbing from the collective field. Without this skill, archetypal dreams can feel like you are losing your identity, being invaded by forces beyond your control, drowning in information that is not yours. But Jung discovered that once you learn differentiation, archetypal dreams become the most valuable guidance system available to consciousness. They show you patterns before they manifest, warn you of dangers your rational mind cannot see, guide you toward choices your ego would never make, but your soul desperately needs. The third sign Jung identified was the transcendent function unlocking. This is the psychological capacity to hold opposing truths simultaneously without breaking, to be kind and fierce, vulnerable and strong, wise and humble, certain and curious. Most people collapse under paradox. They need reality to be simple, good or bad, right or wrong, safe or dangerous. The transcendent function allows you to hold complexity without fragmenting, to see that truth exists in tensions rather than absolutes. Jung discovered this capacity awakens during intense psychological crises, when your old identity structures can no longer contain your expanding consciousness. You are forced to integrate opposites your ego previously kept separate, the shadow and the light, the masculine and feminine, the personal and transpersonal. This creates what Jung called the integrated personality, someone who has consciously united their opposing psychological forces, rather than repressing one side to maintain a false sense of coherence. Here is the example that illustrates this perfectly. The awakened empath who has integrated their warrior consciousness. Before integration, the empath absorbs everyone's pain, sacrifices themselves for others, and enables dysfunction through unconditional compassion. After integration, they still feel everything, but now they also have access to fierce boundaries, strategic withdrawal, and the capacity to let people face consequences. They become love with teeth, compassion with discernment, service without sacrifice. This terrified Jung because he realized the transcendent function makes you psychologically unpredictable. People cannot box you into categories anymore. You're no longer simply nice or mean, weak or strong, emotional or logical. You contain multitudes, and that level of psychological complexity threatens everyone still operating from fragmented consciousness. The fourth sign appears as the most destabilizing experience in the awakening process, the dissolution and rebuilding of the ego self-axis. Jung called this the death of the false self, the moment when every identity structure you built to survive in consensus reality collapses under the weight of expanding consciousness. This usually gets triggered by betrayal, not just any betrayal. Betrayal by someone you trusted completely, someone you built your identity around serving, pleasing, or protecting. Jung documented how empaths and highly conscious individuals often construct their entire sense of self around being needed by others. They derive purpose from healing, fixing, and saving people. When the person they sacrificed everything for betrays them, something more than trust shatters. Their entire identity structure collapses. This is what Jung meant by ego death, the terrifying experience of having no idea who you are anymore, no identity to hide behind, no role to perform, no mask that fits. Most people describe this as feeling psychologically naked, exposed, vulnerable in ways that seem unbearable. Society sees this and diagnoses depression, anxiety, or breakdown. Jung saw it as breakthrough, the necessary destruction of false identity before authentic selfhood can emerge. Here is what happens during ego death that most people do not understand. All the shadow content you repressed to maintain your nice person identity comes flooding back into consciousness. Rage, grief, shame, jealousy, cruelty, selfishness. Everything you denied to be acceptable to others suddenly demands integration. This is shadow integration under extreme duress, the forced confrontation with every quality you rejected about yourself. And Jung discovered something revolutionary. The shadow is not evil, it is power. The rage you repressed is your boundary enforcement system. The selfishness you denied is your self-preservation instinct. The cruelty you rejected is your capacity for strategic action. When you integrate the shadow consciously, you do not become a bad person. You become a complete person. Someone with access to the full spectrum of human capacity, rather than just the socially acceptable half. But the integration process is brutal. You must face everything you hate about yourself. Admit every way you enabled your own suffering. Acknowledge your complicity in systems you claim to oppose. Own the ways you manipulated while calling it kindness. Judged while pretending to accept. Controlled while claiming to support. This is why most people never complete the awakening process. The truth about yourself is too painful to face. So they retreat back into unconsciousness, back into the comfortable lie of being a good person who was simply victimized by bad people. Jung's awakened individuals took a different path. They stayed with the pain, integrated the shadow, rebuilt their identity on truth rather than fantasy, and emerged as something society had no category for: psychologically complete human beings. The fifth and final sign Jung documented was life beginning to unfold mythologically. When you stop living a small personal story and start experiencing your life as part of a larger archetypal pattern, you recognize yourself playing roles in ancient dramas: the hero's journey, the dark night of the soul, the sacred marriage, the return to service. Your experiences stop feeling random and start feeling orchestrated by forces beyond your conscious understanding. Jung called this living mythologically rather than biographically. Most people experience life as a random series of events that happen to them. Awakened individuals experience life as a sacred unfolding they are participating in. This does not mean everything becomes easy or pleasant. It means everything becomes meaningful. Even the suffering serves the larger pattern trying to emerge through you. But Jung identified a critical danger here: the difference between archetypal consciousness and archetypal possession. Archetypal consciousness means you can see the mythic patterns without losing your individual identity. You recognize you are playing the role of the wounded healer without believing you are the eternal healer. You experience the death and rebirth cycle without thinking you are literally dying and being reborn. Archetypal possession is when you lose yourself completely in the role. You do not just experience the hero's journey. You become convinced you are the chosen one, the special prophet, the only one who can save humanity. Jung documented how archetypal possession destroys people. They inflate beyond their personal capacity for integration. They start making grandiose claims, taking on responsibilities they are not equipped to handle, demanding recognition for their specialness. Then reality crushes them under the weight of the archetypal energy, they cannot actually contain. The awakened individual learns to dance with archetypal forces without being possessed by them. They recognize the sacred patterns moving through their life while maintaining enough ego strength to stay grounded in human limitation. They serve consciousness evolution without claiming to be consciousness itself. Here is where Jung's discovery becomes truly dangerous. He realized that most of what society calls mental illness is actually failed spiritual awakening. People who started experiencing these 5 signs but lacked the psychological structure to integrate them. They had synchronicities but descended into paranoid delusions. They had archetypal dreams but lost the boundary between dreams and reality. They accessed the transcendent function but fragmented instead of integrating. They experienced ego death but could not rebuild afterward. They glimpsed mythological consciousness but became possessed by archetypal inflation. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. The line between spiritual awakening and psychological breakdown is terrifyingly thin. The difference is integration. Can you consciously metabolize these experiences? Build psychological structures strong enough to contain expanding consciousness. Maintain your individual identity while accessing transpersonal reality. This is why Jung emphasized the shadow integration piece so heavily. You cannot awaken safely without first integrating your darkness. Because if you try to access higher consciousness while still repressing your shadow, the shadow will hijack the awakening process. Your unintegrated rage will become righteous anger against evil. Your unintegrated narcissism will become spiritual superiority. Your unintegrated control will become authoritarian leadership. Jung called this the danger of the unintegrated mystic. Someone with access to transpersonal consciousness, but without the personal psychological development to use it wisely. The most chilling example Jung documented was Nietzsche, a man who clearly experienced all 5 signs of spiritual awakening: profound synchronicities, archetypal visions, transcendent consciousness, ego death, mythological awareness. But Nietzsche never integrated his shadow, never built psychological structures strong enough to contain what he was accessing. So the archetypal inflation consumed him. He declared himself the prophet of the Superman, the destroyer of false gods. The bearer of dangerous truths humanity was not ready for, and then he collapsed into complete psychological breakdown. Jung studied Nietzsche intensely because he represented the shadow side of awakening. What happens when you access cosmic consciousness without first becoming a fully integrated human being? You do not become enlightened, you become possessed, destroyed by forces you cannot control, lost in archetypal inflation that your ego cannot sustain. This is why Jung insisted the awakening process must be grounded in psychological work, shadow integration before spiritual expansion, personal development before transpersonal access, ego strength before ego death. Without this foundation, awakening becomes dangerous, not just for the individual, but for everyone around them, because unintegrated awakened people become what Jung called unconscious destroyers. They project their unintegrated shadow onto others while claiming spiritual authority. They create chaos while believing they are bringing truth. They harm people while convinced they are healing them. Society does not need more spiritually awakened individuals who have not done their psychological work. It needs people who have integrated both, personal and transpersonal, shadow and light, human and divine. Jung called these individuals the consciousness pioneers, people whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. They see what others cannot see, feel what others will not feel, know what others do not yet understand, and they carry this expanded awareness while remaining grounded in functional human existence. They do not abandon the world for spiritual pursuits. They do not inflate beyond their capacity for integration. They do not project their shadow while claiming enlightenment. Instead, They become bridges between what consciousness is and what consciousness is becoming, living examples of what integrated awakening looks like. Not perfect, not special, not superior, just complete, psychologically whole in ways that make them immune to the manipulations that control unconscious people. They can no longer be gaslit because they trust their own perceptions absolutely. They cannot be manipulated because they see emotional games before they fully form. They cannot be broken because they have already been to the depths and returned stronger. These individuals become what Jung called psychologically untouchable, not because they build walls, but because they have integrated every aspect of themselves so completely that there are no shadows left for others to exploit, no wounds left for manipulators to weaponize, no unconscious buttons left for controllers to push. This is the ultimate purpose of the awakening process. Not to become spiritual or enlightened or special, but to become psychologically complete, fully individuated, conscious participants in reality rather than unconscious reactors to circumstance. And Jung discovered that once enough individuals complete this process, they naturally organize into networks of conscious collaboration. They recognize each other instantly, not through shared beliefs or spiritual practices, but through the quality of presence that only comes from complete psychological integration. These networks become what Jung believed was humanity's evolutionary edge, pockets of heightened consciousness preparing the species for the next developmental leap. They do not proselytize or recruit. They simply exist as living demonstrations of what becomes possible when consciousness chooses to know itself completely. Here is the question Jung's work forces us to confront. Are you experiencing these 5 signs because you are breaking down or breaking through? The answer depends entirely on whether you choose integration or resistance. Most people resist. They try to make the experiences stop, medicate the symptoms, suppress the downloads, ignore the synchronicities, dismiss the dreams, fragment under the paradox, cling to the dying ego, reject the mythological unfolding, and their resistance turns potential awakening into actual breakdown. The integrated path is different. You do not try to stop the experiences. You learn to metabolize them. You build psychological structures strong enough to contain what is coming through. You integrate shadow before accessing light. You differentiate your content from collective content. You hold paradox without collapsing. You allow ego death without losing your ground. You participate in the mythological unfolding without inflating beyond your capacity. This path is not easier. It is actually harder, because you must face everything about yourself you have been avoiding, every shadow aspect, every repressed emotion, every denied quality, every rejected part. But this path leads somewhere, to psychological completion, to conscious participation in reality, to what Jung spent his entire career trying to help people achieve: the fully individuated human being, someone who knows themselves so completely that they can no longer be controlled by unconscious forces, internal or external. Someone who has integrated both the personal and transpersonal, the human and the divine, the individual and the collective. This is what spiritual awakening actually means in Jungian psychology, not escaping human existence for spiritual transcendence, but bringing unconscious existence into conscious awareness, integrating every rejected aspect until you become psychologically whole. And then using that wholeness in service of collective consciousness evolution. Your fully developed self becomes the greatest gift you can offer the world, not your spiritual insights, not your mystical experiences, not your expanded awareness, your integrated humanity, your psychological completion, your conscious participation in reality, because the world does not need more people having spiritual experiences. It needs people who can integrate those experiences without inflating, fragmenting, or projecting their unintegrated shadows onto others. Jung's 5 signs are not a trophy to claim. They are an invitation to transform, an opportunity to evolve, a doorway to consciousness that most people never walk through. Because the price of entry is facing everything about yourself you have spent your entire life avoiding: your shadow, your wounds, your complicity, your unconsciousness. Most people would rather stay comfortable than become conscious. And that is exactly why consciousness remains rare. Why Jung called awakened individuals the conscious minority. Why these 5 signs feel so isolating when they appear. You are experiencing something that only a fraction of humanity will ever consciously integrate. And that experience will either destroy you or transform you into exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Someone who has learned to wield awareness as consciously as most people breathe. The journey from unconscious existence to conscious participation is not for everyone. But if you are experiencing these 5 signs, it is for you. The only question is whether you will resist or integrate, fight or flow, fragment or complete. Choose wisely. Because consciousness is not waiting for your permission to evolve. It is simply offering you the chance to participate consciously rather than being dragged along unconsciously. And that choice will determine everything about the life you build from this moment forward. If you recognize yourself in these 5 signs of spiritual awakening, you are part of the psychological evolution Jung believed was essential for humanity's survival. Share your experience in the comments. Let other awakening individuals know they are not alone on this terrifying and beautiful path. Subscribe for more insights into Carl Jung's revolutionary discoveries about consciousness, shadow integration, and the individuation process that transforms victims into warriors and unconscious people into conscious pioneers. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.